So I just came back from my walk and I felt I needed to make this video. I usually make these, but don't post them on here. But it's easy. I think it's easier just because it's in real time and it's easy to retrieve them, save them differently, make them private. So I'll turn this off. So yeah, and I was on my walk and I also picked up a card for a place that I'll be volunteering moving forward. And I've just been having this reflection, and it touches on what I think to be my deepest conviction, if you like. I hope that doesn't sound pretentious, but I believe it to be my deepest conviction. I obviously don't know what it feels for other humans to have a deeply held conviction. I was going to say thought or idea, but I think it's a conviction because I couldn't explain where it comes from. In other words, I couldn't pinpoint from whence it comes, if you like. Sorry, that's and so when I picked this card up for the place I want to volunteer, I was thinking of the reasons I and perhaps other people are drawn to specific groups of people in wanting to serve them, in wanting to improve their lives, or in wanting to support them in any ways. So in my case, I was reflecting, why do I volunteer for the organizations I volunteer for? Why do I have a soft spot for the communities I have a soft spot for? And I think it got to that deeply held conviction, and it touches on the idea of government and my true feelings on it. And I'll try to capture that as best as I can. And I hope the last video I made like this was quite long. It took up so much storage. I actually don't have enough storage on that device anymore to record similar. But I recently saw a friend that writes stuff on her phone, and I do the same. And she's posting it on Instagram, and it's phenomenal because there's people that have interest in her ideas, but it's also a brilliant way to keep them. I find sometimes I write ideas in different places. Right now, I try to consolidate them, but every now and then I'll get the wrong folder or just write a fresh idea when it comes up in a different folder than the one I'd rather have. That kind of idea. So I liked her. I liked what she's doing. I saw this just yesterday, so I felt inspired to do this as well on here, as it's easier to catalog these thoughts as well, as opposed to having them on different devices. Anyway, the idea I had was, I think the reason I'm drawn to communities, and I'll only speak of one, which is children. Now, some of the stuff I may say may sound ubiquitous. Everyone feels these things. Everyone obviously has a soft spot for kids. But and that's one reason I feel reticent, or I'm reticent sharing this sort of things, because, well, everyone feels these things. Everyone has a soft spot. But I'm also inspired by recent findings. I recently found that from reading some people that look into this sort of thing, that people have an instinctual ability for telling when a thing is authentic, and that gave me hope it gave me faith that perhaps people can make that distinction. Anyways, I think the reason is, well, perhaps I'll start with the government thing. I've always been fascinated by the idea that we have governments, and they exist to basically run society and run the affairs of society, and it's a small contingent of people. That notion has always struck me, and the reason is, humans obviously are imperfect, and when you have a portion of humans with so much power over a population, over other humans, over other entities that have life, I'll speak of this as barely as it comes to my mind, in the sense in which I mean it. I find the idea quite odd. At the same time, I see the necessity for it. And there've obviously been attempts at government arose from what seemed like a societal need, which I recognize, and all these ideas and the Hobbesian idea on the state of nature and how that when people are exist without government or without that centralization, then everyone in their self-interest will infringe on other people's freedoms in the exercise of their own. And I believe that to be true, and I love the law and I love the rule of law. Perhaps that is why I love the law. But at the same time, the notion that humans were made to exist on Earth without a set framework for how it should be run, and yet government is so central to our affairs as humans that we can't even imagine a world without it. It is inevitable that we have governments. All people are under governments. That idea just strikes me. One could envision a world, or it might be the case that we weren't meant to have governments and people could exercise all authority of their own lives or frame their lives as they will. Or there could exist situations where all the constraints that exist in governments and that are passed on to people because they live under those jurisdictions didn't exist. But I think the deepest reflection on governments for me is the idea that not all governments exercise their responsibility with the same degree of integrity or even ability for different reasons of competence, of history, of understanding, of geography, whatever the reasons may be. But there exist governments in this world, especially I'm from Uganda. So there's parts of the world where this current system of government in the world, as we know it, so democracies aren't as strong, institutions aren't as strong. And as a result, the people that live in those contexts don't have lives as conducive to existence, as comfortable as people in other parts of the world. It just strikes me as deeply unfair. So the reason I have a soft spot for kids is I always reflect on how people are born into this world and it's invariable that they ought to live under a government. And by fate, some people are born under governments in which one could predict what their lives will be like. I find it absurd. And that prediction many times points to a life that's rife with suffering, that lacks opportunity, a life of strife. And for majority of such people, it's easy to predict how their lives will end, what the extent of their potential will be. That's my absolute deepest conviction. And every time I see kids from Uganda, from other parts of Africa, especially, I'm struck by the thought, look, how governments grow, how democracies grow, how economies grow, all these things are pretty straightforward. And we have a sense from history of how quickly these things happen, how much time it takes. I don't mean it's quick. I just mean we have a sense of the time required to develop these systems, and it takes generations. And so I look at kids, and sometimes I look at newborn kids back home, and I know there's a 90% chance one could predict how this kid's life could go, or one could put a cap to what this kid could possibly attain. Now, I'm not saying there aren't outliers. I'm not saying one from any part of the world couldn't end up anywhere, or that people couldn't achieve as much as others. People from certain countries that don't have as much opportunity couldn't achieve as much as those that do, or even surpass them. I'm not saying that. I'm saying on the whole, it can be predictable how people's lives will turn out on the basis of the government, which I think to be a superficial imposition on human beings on how strong those governments are. It is the most painful and profound thought I have. And I think it underpins many of my aspirations and my desire to contribute as much as I can to ameliorating that situation in whatever ways I can. Yeah, I think that's it. I might not have explained it quite well, but and I think what makes it almost feels like a burden for me, because I reflect on my position, and the bar isn't very high for attaining where I'm from. And obviously there's lots of people that have attained a lot more than I have in pedigree, in depth of experience, in extent of experience, in exposure. But I would be remiss to say I'm not privileged. I don't use that word in the sense that has been politicized. I'm not trying to make any connotations about my feelings toward that politicization either. I'm just saying I mean I recognize that there is privilege in that, or I have an edge on so many people from where I'm from, and it feels like a burden. I don't ask why, but I ask, so what? And I feel like I have to justify it. Not justify in the sense explain myself or in a sense of guilt, but that it behooves me to use it for good, to help someone. Because I think of so many people, even people that were classmates perhaps, and I see how much potential they've got. I ask myself sometimes why I get the opportunities I get, or I wish they did get an opportunity I did get, or at the very least that they attain the opportunities they wanted to get. And those opportunities could be anything. They could be educational, they could be professional, it could be anything. It could be anything really. It could be social. And sometimes I console myself with the thought that, well, Plato's allegory of the cave, and when people are bound and all they've seen is their shadows, they can't tell there's a whole universe outside. So I convince myself, well, if people from your country haven't seen better, then they don't see their estate as dire as you see it from the outside, looking in, having got this exposure. So I tell myself all these things. But at the same time, I see the sorrow in their eyes. Please, again, I hope I don't sound condescending either. Oh God. I see the clear injustice, perhaps even without hope for anything better or exposure to what could be in their lives or in their society. I still see that the hurdles that do exist shouldn't exist, and that the ability to overcome them is within our reach. So it bothers me. And the reason for it bothers me even more so for kids is adults, I feel, do have some autonomy. And obviously, this doesn't mean they have the ability to choose or to beat fate and direct their lives however they will. I do believe, obviously, that if one puts one's mind to a thing, that they can achieve it. I'm obviously not speaking of that, but what I mean is, when born in a context like my country, I'm aware that an adult could, with the right tools, they have a degree of wherewithal to escape it. When I think of kids, I think two things. One, that's a stage that's most formative, and that in the right conditions, in better conditions, in conditions that do exist for kids elsewhere, their lives would be drastically different, and that those formative years would catapult them into far greater opportunity or experience in the future. And that's one. But two, I think of how they don't have much of a choice. They can't choose where they're born, to whom they're born. It's so painful to see. So painful to see. And I don't even ask for much. I don't really desire to see, I don't know, cities of glass and steel. The basics. The basics. The basics. For crying out loud. Everyone on earth should at least have access to a decent education. At the very least. At the very least. At the very least. People shouldn't be going hungry. People should have decent roads. I'm speaking basic physiological needs. People should have, every human should have access to them, because, again, I think of government in the abstract, ultimately. I know it's easy to justify how we got where we are and what the conditions that led to it, and to cast blame. At this point, I don't care. I just look at us as human beings and think we could choose to run our world however we will, and yet this is where we are, and we think ourselves to be an intelligent species. And I hate that that thought might drive some to be nihilistic or lose faith in humans in general. But I also ask if a tinge of it wouldn't be justified. Because think of it, how could we purport to be an intelligent species and this is the best we can do? How? No. And I obviously understand self-interest and how human nature contributes to the need for the systems we have and informs disparities that do exist in different parts of the world, and explains the state of some of the countries I'm speaking of. But still, if we are indeed an intelligent species, then why does that propensity exist in us? Seriously? Yeah. And again, look, if I were from the US or from a Western European country, I wouldn't worry about these things. And the reason would be, I'm only asking for the basics. I'm only asking for the basics. Just human decency, at the very least. At the very least. I don't think I'd be preoccupied with politics or governance, or even feel the burden I do for these things, if I were born in a country where there was a modicum of dignity that was built into the fabric of society due to the system of government that existed. My reflections are rooted in my having grown up in a home that was, different than majority of the people in my back home. We didn't obviously have much growing up, so it's not as if it was extremely, it wasn't anything. Well, reflecting on seeing opportunity and access to it in the midst of those that didn't made me, I should say, feel this as a burden. And I think one experience that stands out for me is watching, I should wrap this up, watching, so when people beg on the streets, and, people that don't have, people on the streets that beg. And as a kid, I remember my parents did encourage, I hope I don't my parents did encourage, you know, lending a hand. And so it was always an instinct as well for me to try and support. And I think one of the most painful experiences was realizing the helplessness of my contribution in light of the vastness of the issue. You know, I gave and gave and gave till I realized even if I gave all I had, I wouldn't even make a dent in the issue. And I remember sometimes I'd have an amount of money that I knew I'd give. Because I really I felt sorry. And I'd sort of make a hierarchy in my mind of who deserved this the most. And I'd see a kid laying by a taxi park, as we call it. That's where you have the public transport, so equivalent for train station, perhaps. A crippled man who seems to be a mother of 5 on the street, a leper, and make this calculation and in the end give it to one person. Other times, if I had an amount, I would perhaps, so if I had, say, 1,000 shillings, I'd break it into 2 portions, so have 500 shillings for each of the people. And even doing all those, doing those sort of exercises and trying to do as much as I could. Oh, okay, this is lagging. And anyways, yeah, so that experience I feel was quite unnerving. And the reason I think is growing up around so much suffering and being privileged to not be taking part in that kind of suffering. So I'm not saying necessarily insulated from all sorts of suffering, but a specific kind. I think one thing that happens is one grows inured to human suffering. And this is something I want to write on. Many of the things I've said, by the way, are things I want to write about. I intend on writing about, but I think this is helpful as well. It makes one inured to the idea of suffering, because then what used to move one doesn't move one anymore. I think that hardening of the heart, or I think the best way to put it is that fact of becoming inured to human suffering, is, in my mind, one of the biggest pangs of poor governance, because it engenders that sense in a population, become hardened to the suffering of fellow human beings, out of helplessness at that. And I think that's sad. So, by the way, and it's funny, even in the Old Testament, I think 1 Samuel chapter 8, 9, God said he'd be king over the people, and the people asked for a king, and he gives them Saul. He didn't intend, he said this explicitly, that they had a king. He wanted to be king over them. So, how do we get ourselves out of this? How do we get ourselves out of government? How do we govern ourselves better? Think of it. In 1,000 years, will it be different? I hope so, for the sake of those people. And I believe we'll know what will be going on. And it's so funny. I'm currently reading Kelly Shagan's book, Death. And he talks about his philosophical justification for why he doesn't believe in death, because he doesn't buy into dualism, which is the idea that humans have a soul that survives their death, which he explains very well. He's a physicalist, so humans are simply bodies. Anyways, I do believe in the soul, and I hope in many millennia to come, humans will redeem themselves from this situation. At the very least, I hope in our lifetime, in my lifetime, I will see the people for whom I have the deepest soft spot. I'll only mention kids. I don't want people to weaponize those groups against me, to use that revelation against me in any sense. Because, yeah, but yeah, I hope we can at the very least have improvement in their lives. Perhaps not the equivalent of what we've seen in some of the most advanced countries, but a degree of it. That's my reflection for now. And yeah, I'll say one last thing. No, that's it.